I'm here to talk about something a little bit different from what you've heard so far. So we've been talking about really exciting things like UI and how to make products exciting. I want to take a step back from that a little bit and talk about some of the things that are not so great about technology. Namely, are we getting addicted to it? And if we are, does it matter? Who here thinks they're addicted to the internet? Does anybody think they have a problem with the internet? About half the room. Right, okay. Well, I think I have a problem with the internet too. So I'm going to talk you through some work that I've been doing recently. I'm a writer, and I've been thinking about whether internet addiction is a serious problem. If it is a serious problem, do we need to do something about it? Okay. So I think it's pretty obvious from the title of my talk that the answer to that second question is going to be yes. It does matter. So let's concentrate on the first one. Okay, so I've been writing and thinking about internet addiction for a long time, but it's only with the rise of social networks I've really felt like we have a problem on our hands. Because we do. So let's start with a few questions I've been thinking about. Now, social networking and social gaming companies are among the success stories in the latest wave of innovation and high valuations in the Valley, but how are they doing it? Well, it's really simple. These companies are engineering their platforms to make them addictive. Facebook is engineering its platform to keep you locked in, to make you want to spend as much time as possible on Facebook. And other companies are doing this same thing. So I come to believe that the internet, technology in general, however beautiful the UI, however wonderful the things that we're creating, is actually fueling some quite destructive and some quite damaging behavior, sex addiction, and shopping addiction. Okay, so that's what I was going to talk about today. And then I got this email. Login invites you on a romantic date. I thought, oh God, this isn't very romantic. And the email said, we're looking forward to seeing you, it's going to be great, and we just want to let you know that one of the themes of this year's Login conference is going to be the future invites you to a romantic date and digital love. And I thought, bugger, what am I going to talk about now? And so it got me thinking. I was thinking, right, what do I talk about? What is appropriate here? What's the most appropriate example of addiction? What, through the prism of addiction, can I talk about in the respect of digital love? And I came up with this. This is Paris Hilton. She's lovely, isn't she? So Paris, like the pornography that her image draws on, is what I call engineered to be irresistible. Now, pornography is one of the fastest spreading addictions today, but it's also one of the least researched and one of the most poorly understood. People don't really want too much information on this topic because, frankly, it's a little unsavory. Now, what information we do have about internet pornography suggests that there is an enormous and terrifying explosion in worldwide pornography addiction. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what that means, and I have a stack of facts and figures that you'll see me keep coming back to, which I hope you don't mind. So let me give you an example of how people are manipulated with regard to their addictions. And I'm going to give you an example from outside the world of technology. It's fast food. Did you know that McDonald's employs a scientist who gets paid more than $300,000 a year to precisely engineer their food to have the correct proportions of fat, salt, and sugar to make it irresistible, to make it addictive, to make it food that you keep wanting to come back to, food that you can't stop eating. And lots of people can't stop eating it. Lots of people get addicted. Now, as far as pornography goes, now the next 45 minutes, I hope you like pornography, by the way, because we're going to be talking about it in quite some detail. I think if you think what I'm saying is melodramatic, let me give you some facts and figures here. So since 2006, there's been an explosion of free porn on the internet. I think we know this. Okay, so we have things like Xtube, which are user-generated content alternatives to traditional sources of pornography. Well, let's have a look at some numbers. Newspaper articles often claim that porn sites attract 72 million unique users a month, but the figure is based on research from before this UGC revolution. The numbers on Xtube suggest it's a gross underestimate. Now, there's a homosexual couple on one of these websites who claim 90 million views for their explicit videos. Now, it seems to be there's an overlap of constituencies between men and interest in these pornographic kinds of content. But just think about that for a second. 90 million views for these two guys, right? Right? Okay, so now how many of these people are watching this are really going to develop an addiction? Well, we can't be sure because there's no real agreed definition of porn addiction. Now, just to be clear, I'm going to be talking a lot about pornography, but what I'm really trying to do is use pornography as an example of how technology just both creates and fuels addictions. So let me talk to you about very explicit images. I'm afraid this is the best you're going to get because I write for a family newspaper, so you're not going to get anything better than this today. Now, that's the closest we're going to get to anything racy. In fact, we'll just skip past this. I want to show you a picture. This is an etching from 1751 by Hogarth. It's called Gin Lane. Now, this shows in London some of the consequences of an explosion in gin addiction. It was the first time that distilled spirits were made readily available. Now, what it shows is the consequence of a rapid acceleration. And acceleration is one of the key features of addiction. Now, what happens is a horrible fallout in the working classes where people become addicted to gin. They can't help themselves. Now, I'm going to suggest to you that something very similar is happening on the internet with pornography and with social networking. Now, what our best guesses tell us is that internet pornography has a special facility for rewiring the brain's reward circuits, just like some drugs do, and just like social networks are engineered to do. Now, that's pretty terrifying when you think about it. So, how much of the blame lies with pornographers? Well, here's a quote from a 65-year-old American man who's struggling to control his addiction to pornography. He says, "I used to have to go out of my way to specialist stores. Now you'd have to be a clamshell on the moon to ignore it," which gives you some idea of how the proliferation of content enabled by the internet is making pornography almost impossible to avoid. Now, here's a slightly more interesting quote. "The way people access porn has changed drastically since I was a teenager." The speaker's 24 years old. He's 24 years old. So that gives you some idea of how rapid the acceleration is and the difference of access and availability of all sorts of material. Now, whether you're 65 or you're 24, the social significance of pornography has changed dramatically. There's no longer social stigma attached, or at least there are no longer social barriers preventing us from accessing pornography. What does that mean? Well, it means a lot more people are accessing it. You look back to Samuel Pepys, who described a book of pornography like this. He said he picked up an idle, roguish book in plain binding, and then he describes how he sort of took it home and burnt it afterwards. Skip forward to 2006, and 4.2 million websites contain pornography. That's 12% of the internet. 1.5 billion pornographic downloads are happening every month, which is 35% of all download traffic. We've moved in an incredibly short space of time in terms of human civilization from picking up a book in a grubby store to 12% of the internet. That's amazing. This is Gail Dines. Now, Gail Dines is a sociology professor who's America's best-known authority on the effect of porn on women. Now, she says images today aren't just getting more common, they're also changing. They're becoming more extreme. They're becoming more cruel. They're becoming more graphic. They're becoming more violent. Internet pornography is becoming more extreme. And this isn't just strange and niche kink or pornography interest sites hidden away deep in the internet. This is all pornography, and this is all pornography that everybody is looking at. Why are people beginning to get excited about more and more extreme forms of pornography? This is a troubling development, isn't it? Well, yes. Now, how do we account for this? Well, one of the things that is interesting to look at is a correlation between that and the medium of communication through which this stuff is transferred. Now, when a means of communication is invented, the pornography industry gets very quickly in on the act, particularly if the medium is unregulated. It happened with printing, it happened with photography, it happened with television, and now it's happening to an extraordinary extent on the internet. In fact, in the last few decades, pornography has been driving the technology as well as the other way around. Now, some of you may know some of the anecdotes about technology being responsible for the success of VHS over Betamax, for example. What you may not know is that, in fact, not only was pay-per-view cable basically driven by pornography, not only were the hotel chains, you go into a hotel room and you have your television and your pay-per-view, all of this was actually driven because the hotels realized that there was an enormous revenue channel available in pornography. Now, two things are happening seriously. Both porn studios are both diversifying their products, but they're also testing a rapidly growing market with these new distribution mechanisms. And some of this is a little bit worrying, because what's happening is we're getting tricked into accessing this ever more violent and grotesque pornography. Now, this is a writer, he writes for the New York magazine, Benjamin Wallace, and he says, there you are, just surfing around, and suddenly you get hijacked, you get tricked into looking at this incredibly extreme material you never really meant to, these pop-overs and these pop-unders, and oh my God, there's this woman and she's talking to me and I'm on a webcam, can she see me? I can see her. What is going on? Well, much of the same thing that Facebook does to you. When you're browsing around a photo album and you're wondering to yourself, maybe I should be doing some work, or I should call my girlfriend, and you notice this little nostalgia box in the top. Nostalgia, what does that mean? And you look, and there's a picture of you from 9 months ago, and you've forgotten that you even went to this party, and there's a picture of the girl you don't date anymore standing next to you going, and you think, okay, all right, well, I'll revisit it. I'll have a little look. I'll see what's going on there. And you get sucked in for another 10 minutes looking at photos of you from 9 months ago. Now, much of the same stuff is going on. The same strategies are being employed. There's a bit of a difference with social networks, and that is that they're not trying to fuel, not actively or not consciously trying to fuel bad behavior in you. But what they are doing is using a lot of the same human vulnerabilities to make you spend longer on their site. Why? So they can sell you things. They do it so that their advertisers and their partners can sell you things, can make money out of you. Because the longer you stick around, the more valuable you are to them. Pretty much like porn. So, porn is obviously a business, which means that the content is shaped by the contours of marketing and of technology and competition in the industry. And many of the most powerful corporations in the world make a lot of money out of pornography. Time Warner Cable admits it quite freely. Microsoft doesn't admit it quite so freely, but Microsoft too, because of the technology of their platforms, makes a lot of money out of porn. And the drift towards hardcore pornography isn't really being acknowledged by any of these companies. It's very interesting. It's very interesting indeed. So next, what I'd like to talk to you a little bit about is what's going on in the brain. What's happening? This is a little diversion into neuroscience. What is going on? Well, a lot of it's got to do with pleasure, reward, and a lot of it's got to do with excitement. It seems to be that pornography, it seems to be that these bad things that we get addicted to are pushing on the same little pleasure channels that Facebook does, the same little reward circuits that Twitter does. When you check, you frantically check for status updates because you want to know whether anybody has added you. I did this really hilarious tweet, and I want to know, has anybody replied? Has anybody said, ho, ho, lol? Well, some of those same reward circuits are being rewarded by pornography and by social networks. Now, I don't mean to tie these two things together so closely as I have to in the short time we have available, but I'm just using pornography as an example of an industry that is strategizing against you in a really very intelligent way. Now, the difference with technology is that Facebook has an enormous amount of information about how you use its site because it's tracking you. Everything you do, it's watching you. It's looking at how you behave. It's looking at the sorts of things that you look at, and it's learning from that. And so are all the other sites. So Zynga. When they make a game, they measure, they do simple A/B testing, and they measure whether it keeps somebody longer on the site to have the character this size or this size. It's very simple stuff. Now, pornographers have to take a slightly more intuitive approach to this, but really the same thing is going on in both cases. So when we become excited, we anticipate pleasure. We have this little surge of dopamine, which is a chemical messenger associated with reward. Now, our tension levels rise rather than fall, because this isn't happiness, this is anticipation and excitement. And that explains why you keep coming back for more. See, when Facebook deploys these strategies to keep you engaged and keep you involved, it's not really satisfying anything. It's making you want even more afterwards. And that same thing is happening too with pornography. So it's quite complicated how the brain functions in this regard, but suffice it to say that technology companies and social networks are even better than pornography at doing this, because they have such huge volumes of data on what actually works. They have enormous quantities of information about what makes you tick and how to keep you hooked. So does internet porn create these tastes, or does it just facilitate them? Are we all latent porn addicts? Well, I like to think no. I don't think I am. But there is some evidence that the internet is creating desires that weren't there previously. And I think we can see that in the changes that Nicholas Carr talks about in his book, The Shallows, about the way people think, the way their minds are operating when they spend a lot of their time on a computer. So you're on the computer, and you're editing a Word document, and you've got your email open, and you've got Twitter, and you've got Skype, and you've got all of these other networking platforms, and they're all pinging and buzzing and demanding your attention all the time, and they want you, and your friend is saying this, but you've got this email to write, and that's not finished, and oh my God, there's just so much. So we develop this agile brain that can skip between different tasks very quickly. And it's wonderful. It's wonderful to see how agile your mind becomes. But the problem is, we're losing, so Nicholas Carr says, the ability to really concentrate for sustained periods of time and to understand sustained arguments. Now, I don't entirely buy his thesis. The original essay was called, "Is Google Making Us Stupid?" Well, no, I don't think it is. I think the internet is making Nicholas Carr a bit stupid, because his book is pretty bad. But the question that he's asking is, does technology change the way our brains are wired? And there is some evidence to suggest that that's true. Now, when we talk about porn addiction, internet addiction, you think, well, addiction, isn't this a bit strong? Addiction, really, addiction. Are we addicted? Are we like a junkie on the street? Well, actually, what you'll discover is that the behaviors associated with internet addiction, with porn addiction, and with social networking addiction map directly onto what we know about other kinds of addiction. Like this charming lady. Now, when you talk to internet porn addicts, they quite often use some telling language. They'll use phrases like binging, something I'm sure this lady is acquainted with. They'll use phrases like gorging. And you'd imagine that in the case of pornography, once you've done whatever you're going to do with it, that you'll be fine to go about your day. But actually what happens is, like what I was talking about, the little pleasure reward thing that actually just makes you want more because it's not really satisfying, that's what happens to her. When she eats, whatever the hell that is, she gets to the end of it, she's stuffed, she may throw up, but she's not satisfied, so she asks for another one. Same thing's happening with internet pornography, and the same thing is happening with social networking too. Now, the junk food industry creates products with precisely the right combinations of fat, salt, and sugar. Facebook does the same with analyses of user behavior on its site, just like Zynga does with games, just like online pornographers do. So now we have to ask, well, does this matter? Why should we care? Well, I think we should care. I'll give you an example of why we should care. Some of these things that we're getting sucked into on the internet are creating real-world consequences. Internet pornography is getting more violent, getting more extreme, getting more grotesque, and it's having an effect on how people behave. It's having an effect on people's interpersonal relationships. It's having an effect on young people. Now, Gail Dines talks about this. She says that young men are having their understanding of what sex is and the relationship between interpersonal relationships and physical acts. That understanding is being broken down because young people are growing up thinking that what they see in these extreme and exploitative videos is how people express love for one another. So they ask questions like, should my partner be screaming? How do I make her scream? This is not what love is. This is not what a connection with another human being is. But young people are having their expectations of physical intimacy defined by a lot of the pornography that they're watching. Now, some of the same thing is going on with social networks. People's expectations of the depth and seriousness of their relationships with other human beings, I would like to suggest to you, are being in part defined by the shallowness of their interaction on social networks. So when we're communicating with people in terms of comments and Facebook status updates, what's happening is that we're no longer really worrying about how deep and coherent and loving our interactions are with other human beings. So I'll give you a quick example of something that is a real-world consequence. Okay, so heavy porn users in general, they report erectile dysfunction. They have problems with their real sex life. So somebody from New York Magazine interviewed a 43-year-old called Stefan. He was a composer who said that when he had sex with his wife, he had to resort to playing those scenes over in his head because rather than having that loving relationship with his wife, what he was doing was triggering those other pleasure reward circuits that don't satisfy him. So he was actually unable to have a successful physical intimacy with his wife because his expectations and his pleasure expectations about the physical act of sex have been defined by his experiences with pornography. And this is just getting worse. Now, there is a global rise in addictive behaviors at the moment. It's measurable. We can see it from the increases in drink and drug-related deaths. We can see it from the new addictions popping up in places they didn't exist before. We can also see it from some of the statistics about the consumption of these things online. Now, we've got to a point where addiction's actually going to start to really affect the lives of women particularly. Because the number of women who look at pornography is comparatively small, probably because the deluge of porn images triggers a desire for novel partners that might suit the male brain better. But women whose partners are habitual porn users find their sex lives disrupted in the sorts of ways I just mentioned. And women have come under pressure to meet sexual expectations set by the internet. So they feel like they have to look a certain way. They feel like they have to groom themselves a certain way. They feel like they have to do all of the things that they've seen these women do in videos, which are designed simply to keep up the interest of men for a few minutes. Now, in Britain, more than a quarter of 14 to 17-year-olds go porn surfing every week. They're looking at videos of girls doing all sorts of things. It may not be helpful to describe these boys as addicts, since there's nothing unusual about an uncontrollable adolescent sex drive, but they are being exposed to material that is designed to trigger addictive desires in older people. That's what I'm talking about when I say that there's a problem here with young people having unfettered access because of what the internet has done to the availability of content, of video, of images, and even of text too. Now it's so easy to access. These are some of the problems we're starting to see. And I think we can map the sort of short, snarky, unsatisfying communications on networks like Twitter to observable generational changes in young people's behavior too. So what I'm trying to show here is that internet porn addiction bears remarkable similarity to regular porn, but also it's unique, and also it's got something very much in common with social networks too. Now, one of the things that's really interesting about all of this is OCD. Now, I'm a bit OCD, so I have my iTunes library really carefully organized. I like to think it's beautiful. Everything's spelled correctly. I've got square brackets with edition details after every different version of albums I have, so I know which bonus tracks are coming up next. Real fucking geeky stuff, right? Now, I'm guessing there are quite a few other people in the room who are a bit like this too. Now, one of the things that both internet pornography and social networks are doing is tapping in to these OCD impulses that we have, and some of the people who are most vulnerable to these impulses are becoming completely enslaved by them. So, in the popular imagination, OCD is associated with things like washing hands, but actually it's about ritualistic behavior. And when you think about the rituals that are constructed around people's access to and interaction with Facebook and Twitter, what you discover is that people are sinking enormous quantities of time into these social networks. Their daily rituals are being reimagined and redesigned around interaction that is fundamentally meaningless. So, I would say that Apple and its perfectly controlled iOS environment provides the perfect conditions for these sorts of damaging impulses to flourish. And the reason for that is that it provides in platforms like iTunes the perfect conditions for people to indulge in these impulses. Now, if you enter the words collector, jailed, which sounds like a bit of a weird combination, but if you put collector jail, you think, well, what would somebody be jailed for collecting? Well, it's pornography, and you'll find some amazing statistics. You'll find Catholic priests who have collected 30,000 images of child abuse, of bestiality. 30,000 people. Now, it's impossible they've actually seen all these things, which tells us that rather than being satisfied by the content, they're getting trapped into these ritualized behaviors that are all about collecting, sorting, and filing. I find some days I spend more time naming stuff in my iTunes library than I do listening to music. What has gone wrong here with technology that is creating barriers between us and other people, between us and content, between us and art, us and beauty, us and all of the things that we actually love? What is going on when my iTunes library is sitting between me and my music, when my Twitter feed is sitting between me and my friends? Now, you might say that we're communicating more than ever before because of these technologies, but the truth is we just don't know. We don't know whether that's true. What we can do is measure differences in people's behaviors, and there are pieces of research going on. There are measurable changes in young people's behavior towards one another. Young people are losing the ability to pick up on subtle body language. The subtleties and nuances of little verbal cues and paralinguistic gestures are being lost and replaced by the emoticon. Now, that's not just me scaremongering and being a kind of fuddy-duddy right-wing, technophobe. I'm a technology columnist. I fucking love this stuff. But it's an example of where we may be going a little wrong in prioritizing the medium over the message. I think Twitter's a good example of this. It's a good example of the kind of company that seems to have inherited this philosophy that technology is somehow inherently socially good. It's ridiculous. Surely it's about the messages people are posting. But there's this halo around Twitter which seems to regard itself as the engine of democracy, the engine of revolution. The people who champion it, the social media gurus, call Twitter, not just an enabling tool for revolution, an enabling tool for spreading democracy. They seem to be claiming that it is itself a cause. And that I find slightly troubling. Now, we're talking more about sort of slot machine mechanisms in gambling addiction. I think computer gaming is a great example of something that is causing a lot of problems. The people who are being manipulated and engineered out of normal interaction and into these controlled worlds. Now, you know what this is, right? Angry Birds. Now, I interviewed this guy, Peter Westerbacher, whose job title is Mighty Eagle at Rovio, the creators of Angry Birds. And he told me in terrifying detail how much data they're collecting about you when you play this game, and what they do with it, how they use it to make you completely sucked into the world of Angry Birds, to make you play it for 4 hours a day, like lots of people do. Now imagine, okay, 4 hours, who really cares about this, whatever. But imagine if we all played Angry Birds for 4 hours a day. I mean, all of us. Imagine that, right? And plenty of us do. All right, everyone in this room is hooked on a game like this of some kind or something else like it, because we all love technology. We're all involved in technology. And given the complex analytical tools at the disposal of the companies who create this stuff, we are all deeply vulnerable to being engineered into these worlds, spending our money and wasting our time. And my question to you today is, hasn't something gone a bit wrong there? Hasn't something gone a bit wrong when we're being trapped in these mediating surfaces? I think it has. I think we're being pulled away from other people, not towards them. Now, does some internet porn achieve a similar effect? Well, yes, it does. And it goes some way to explaining the drift towards extreme images. An unhappily married man who takes up porn surfing knowing vaguely that he's attracted to younger women may end up trapped in the rough equivalent of Angry Birds. It's not structured like Angry Birds is structured, but it is the same emotional cycle of reward, pleasure, scaling up and up. Another typical feature of addiction, which is the acceleration and the need for an ever greater hit, which is analogous, if you like, to increasing levels of difficulty in computer games. And computer games are something that there are things that map really closely and really well directly onto everything we know about addictive behaviors. Now, something else we need to talk about is loneliness. Now, I feel lonely sometimes. I'm sure all of you feel lonely sometimes. But the question to ask, and I'm not offering an answer to this, is, are these technologies helping with the feelings of increased isolation and alienation that many of us feel in this new world of decentralized, technologically enabled free marketeering? Are we being helped by having Twitter and Facebook and these endless feeds all around distracting our attention from the fact that we're alone? I'm not sure we are. Now, I guess those priests who downloaded 30,000 images were feeling pretty lonely. And I guess that lots of people who get addicted to these things are really lonely. Now, one thing that helps people with loneliness often is religion. You might say, well, there's a hell of a lot worse than technology. I'd rather be addicted to Facebook than addicted to God. Well, let me invoke an authority that may surprise you a little bit, given that we're talking about the internet. This is Pope Benedict XVI. Now, I know a lot of people scoff at religion and what religion has to say about technology, about everything, really. But let me just quote you something that Pope Benedict said about the internet. Now, he said, "A large number of young people establish forms of communication that do not increase humaneness, but instead risk increasing a sense of solitude and disorientation. That they're being numbed by the internet. It is an educational emergency, a challenge that we can and must respond to with creative intelligence." Now look, there's no measure by which we can judge isolation, but we can make some observations about the behavior in the internet era. And there is a rise in self-destructive behaviors. There is a rise in addictive behaviors. There is a rise in all of these things that has an effect not just on our attention, what we do every day, how much money we make, but it has an effect on our emotional well-being too. It has an effect on the way we deal with other people. It has an effect, ultimately, on our happiness. Now, people used to laugh at BlackBerry addicts who were, and people still do, and I am one, but at least there was probably some productivity going on there, because what I also want to point out are some of the economic consequences of people getting sucked into these worlds. Now, see, it used to be that, Crackberry addicts, well, they were probably checking work emails, right? Now it's hipsters with iPhones being stuck on Angry Birds, Twitter, and Facebook. What we're seeing, when you look, there are studies done about this, and they put tracking software on jailbroken iPhones, and they look over quite long periods of time about how usage changes when somebody cottons on to social networks. And what we're seeing happen is less time spent on calls and emails and more time spent on things like Angry Birds, which is just a bit weird. It's a good game, but it's not that good. There's one guy in Ohio who spends 10 hours a day on Angry Birds. He says his life has been completely ruined by Angry Birds. And he says that prior to discovering this game, He felt like he had a reasonably normal life, although he liked computer games. And he said something that was interesting, which was that he felt like with every new iteration and special version of the game that came out, he was somehow being manipulated into staying. And of course, that's because that's exactly what's happening. Now, just to draw to a close, I think we are communicating with each other more than ever before. But communication doesn't always, and in fact doesn't often, mean better quality communication. Just because you're sharing updates on Facebook, jokes on Twitter, your photos on Flickr, where you are on Doppler. People still use Doppler? I don't know. I'm afraid it doesn't mean that you're better connected to the person that you're communicating with. It means that we know a lot about a few people instead of it means we know a little bit about a lot of people rather than a lot about a few people. And I've seen the difference in my life, my friendships, my communications with people deteriorate because of my predilection for this communication with vast numbers of people at once. Now, you can say there's no evidence to support, to suggest people are communicating in the real world any less, but we just don't know. Pope seems to think that technology is blurring the boundary between truth and illusion in the context of technologies like Twitter that prioritize the medium over the message. And that's the root of this strange idea that the digital utopians have, that somehow technology is an intrinsic good. It's the sort of crap you hear about Egypt and Libya. You know, we live in this age of intolerable and endless cries for our attention from all of the devices that we hold around us. Fighting for our attention, beneath all of that, is the desire for genuine human interaction. Now, I'm not going to try to conclude that that is being lost irrevocably or permanently, that it has been lost. What I'm asking you to do is think about the amount of time that you're devoting to the people you love, the amount of time that you're devoting to your career, the amount of time that you're devoting to things that matter, because my hunch is that these companies who have an enormous financial interest in sucking you in making you engage with, is their favorite word, and love social media and all of the wonderful attention-grabbing and distracting things there are on the internet. They have a vested interest in dragging you away from the things that really matter. So that thing that the Pope said about education, I think, is also true. We know that Facebook addicts do worse in school for all the sorts of reasons I've been talking about. While we are losing control of our privacy online as well, we're communicating less of what really matters because we're more worried about what we say online, so we tend to say little, or we tend to say nothing of any consequence. We say nothing of any real value, I find, online. And as much more of our communication shifts online, my concern is that the deep and genuine human contact that we all need, without which we sink into dangerous and destructive addictive behaviors, that we are losing it. I think we are. Now, since it was invented, we'll go back to pornography for a second, it's always turned women into sexual objects. It's done something that all addictions do, which is replace people with things. But these things are distractions. And it's what's going on with Twitter, and it's got what's going on with iPhones, it's got what's going on with all of these new technologies that represent an opaque layer between us and other people. We're dealing here with an addictive experience that is evolving faster than our ability to describe it or deal with it, let alone to limit its harm. We've already considered the possibility that food and sex triggers binge behaviors, but looking at online porn is an activity almost as inescapable as eating, because food and sex are such basic desires. Now, we don't know how popular porn is going to become. What we can guess is that things are only going to get worse. But the thing to remember is that internet pornography is the one that really troubles the experts. It's the one that pushes all of our buttons, and it's the one that social networks seem to map really closely onto in the precise ways they appeal to our vulnerabilities. So, something to think about. Now, this is a technology conference, and this has been a talk about technology. I don't want to leave you with the impression I hate computers. I think the contributions made to society by technology are incredible, but let's remember, in the spirit of that romantic invitation that I received last week, to be careful how much of our lives that we are sacrificing. Let's remember the difference between the medium and the message. Let's remember the difference between 2D and 3D. Let's remember the difference between those mediating surfaces and real life, because it looks as though there are plenty of people out there who are forgetting the difference, and sooner or later, they're going to come back needing our help. They're becoming enslaved to what sound like trivial and funny addictions, but actually have very dangerous and troubling real-world consequences. They do that at terrible peril to their humanity and at terrible peril to ours. Thank you.